Silence. The kind of silence that exists only in the moments before chaos. December 2nd, 1805. The sun rises over the Moravian countryside near a village called Austerlitz, its weak winter light illuminating a landscape about to be transformed into hell. 73,000 French soldiers stand in formation, their breath visible in the frozen air. They can hear it now, distant at first, then growing louder. The rumble of 90,000 Russian and Austrian troops marching toward them. The sound of boots on frozen ground, thousands upon thousands of them, like the beating of war drums that will not stop. And at the center of the French lines, on horseback, sits a man who has already rewritten the rules of warfare. A man who in just 6 years has risen from artillery captain to Emperor of France. A man whose name will become synonymous with military genius and catastrophic ambition. Napoleon Bonaparte. He is 36 years old, and today he will fight what he will later call his most perfect battle. But this is not a story about one battle. This is the story of 12 years that reshaped Europe. 12 years of innovation and carnage. 12 years that proved that one man's genius could conquer a continent, and that the same genius could destroy him. Welcome to the mechanics of war. Today we dissect the Napoleonic Wars, the conflict that gave birth to modern warfare and left 3 million dead in its wake. The mechanics of this war begin not on battlefields, but in the mind of one man who understood something his enemies did not. That warfare itself had changed, and those who clung to the old ways would be swept away like leaves before a storm. To understand how Napoleon conquered Europe, you must first understand what made him different. The armies he faced in 1803 were relics of an earlier age. They moved slowly, their supply lines stretched behind them like umbilical cords. They fought in rigid lines, their tactics unchanged for decades. Their commanders were aristocrats who had purchased their positions, men who learned warfare from books written 50 years prior. They believed in sieges that lasted months, in campaigns that paused for winter, in battles fought by rules of honor and convention. Napoleon believed in none of this. He had studied every great commander from Alexander to Frederick, but he understood that their methods belonged to their time. This was a new era, born in the fires of the French Revolution, and it demanded new ways of war. The first principle of Napoleonic warfare was speed. While his enemies laboriously transported supplies in wagon trains, Napoleon taught his soldiers to live off the land, to forage and requisition what they needed. This freed his army from the tyranny of supply lines. His corps system, a revolutionary organizational structure, divided his army into self-sufficient units that could march separately and converge on the battlefield. While a traditional army might cover 12 miles in a day, Napoleon's corps could cover 30, sometimes more. His enemies would plan to intercept him at one location, only to discover he had already bypassed them entirely. The second principle was the decisive battle. Napoleon had no patience for the careful maneuvering of 18th century warfare. He sought to bring his enemy to battle and destroy them completely, not simply outmaneuver them. His battles were shorter, more violent, more conclusive than anything Europe had seen. In an era when armies might face each other for days before committing to combat, Napoleon attacked immediately, ferociously, with overwhelming force concentrated at the critical point. The third principle was artillery. Napoleon was an artillery officer by training, and he revolutionized its use. Previous commanders scattered their guns along the line. Napoleon massed them, creating grand batteries of 60, 80, even 100 cannons concentrated at one point, smashing holes in enemy formations before his infantry advanced. The sound was apocalyptic. Veterans spoke of the ground shaking, of the air itself seeming to tear apart, of being unable to hear their own thoughts over the thunder of Napoleon's guns. And there was something else, something intangible, but perhaps most important of all. Napoleon understood psychology. He understood that warfare was fought in the minds of men as much as on the field. He crafted his own legend deliberately, issuing proclamations that spoke of glory and destiny, sleeping among his soldiers, remembering their names, making them believe they were not merely troops but participants in something historic. When Napoleon's soldiers marched into battle, they did not march for France alone. They marched for him. By 1805, Napoleon had crowned himself emperor. The revolution that had executed a king now had an emperor who commanded the largest, most modern army on the continent. And the old monarchies of Europe, watching this upstart who had crowned himself with his own hands, decided he must be destroyed. Austria, Russia, and Britain formed the third coalition. Their plan was simple, at least on paper. Austrian and Russian armies would combine their forces, creating a massive army of overwhelming size that would crush the French through sheer weight of numbers. Napoleon was in Paris when he received word that Austrian forces had already invaded Bavaria, a French ally. The coalition expected him to take weeks to respond, to gather his forces, to march east slowly with proper supply arrangements. Napoleon's response took 6 weeks, not 6 weeks to prepare, 6 weeks to march the entire Grande Armée from the English Channel to southern Germany, encircle an entire Austrian army at Ulm, and force its surrender without fighting a major battle. 27,000 Austrian soldiers became prisoners. Their Russian allies, still marching west to join them, found nothing but empty ground where an allied army should have been. But the Russians kept coming. Tsar Alexander I, young and proud, convinced he could succeed where Austria had failed, advanced with his army into Moravia. And Napoleon, rather than crushing them immediately, did something that confused every observer. He retreated. He withdrew from the advantageous positions he had secured. He allowed the Russians and their remaining Austrian allies to occupy the Pratzen Heights, the high ground overlooking the plain of Austerlitz. His officers were baffled. The old guard whispered that perhaps the emperor had lost his nerve. Napoleon had lost nothing. He was setting a trap. The mechanics of Austerlitz reveal Napoleon at his most brilliant. He had read his enemies perfectly. Tsar Alexander was young, eager for glory, surrounded by advisers who whispered that Napoleon was weak, that one decisive victory would drive the French back across the Rhine. Napoleon wanted them to be confident. He wanted them to be aggressive. He sent envoys to request negotiations, making himself seem desperate. He abandoned strong positions, making himself seem afraid. He even weakened his right flank deliberately, making it appear vulnerable to attack. The coalition commanders saw what they wanted to see. They formulated a plan to descend from the Pratzen Heights, sweep around Napoleon's right flank, cut his army off from Vienna, and destroy him. It was an elegant plan. It would have worked against almost any other commander. It would not work against Napoleon. December 2nd arrives. The morning fog is so thick that soldiers cannot see 50 feet ahead. The coalition commanders, confident and aggressive, exactly as Napoleon predicted, begin their descent from the heights, sending the bulk of their forces sweeping toward the French right. Hours pass. The fog begins to lift, And then the Russians and Austrians, committed now to their flanking maneuver, realize their mistake. Napoleon has pulled his right flank back, yes, but he has reinforced it enough to hold. And the Pratzen Heights, the commanding position that dominated the entire battlefield, the position the coalition held at dawn, is now almost undefended, because 2/3 of their army is descending into the valley below, committed to an attack that is already failing. Marshal Soult, commanding the French center, receives the order he has been waiting for since dawn. One sharp blow and the war is over, Napoleon tells him. 24,000 French troops surge forward, climbing the heights the enemy has just abandoned. The Russians and Austrians, seeing this, realize the catastrophe unfolding. They try to reverse their movement, to climb back up the heights they had thought secure, but armies do not reverse direction easily. The coalition forces on the heights are scattered units, rear guards, not the main force. The French hit them like a hammer. Within hours, the Russian and Austrian position collapses. Their army, stretched across the valley in their flanking maneuver, is now split in two. The French occupy the high ground. Coalition units attempting to retreat find themselves pushed toward frozen ponds. The ice breaks under the weight of men and horses and artillery. Thousands drown in freezing water, their screams echoing across the battlefield. Cannonballs fired into the ice send geysers of water and bodies into the air. By nightfall, the coalition army has ceased to exist as a fighting force. 15,000 Russians and Austrians lie dead. An additional 12,000 are prisoners. Napoleon has lost 9,000 men. Austria sues for peace immediately. Russia withdraws eastward, its young Tsar humiliated. The Holy Roman Empire, which had existed for 1,000 years, formally dissolves. Napoleon has redrawn the map of Europe in a single afternoon. And the world understands now what it is dealing with. This is not simply a talented general. This is something unprecedented, a military mind that operates on a different level entirely. The old rules of warfare have not simply been rewritten, they have been made obsolete. But victory breeds new enemies. Britain, safe behind the Royal Navy, refuses to make peace. Prussia, watching Napoleon's power grow, begins to mobilize. Spain, a French ally, becomes uneasy. The mechanics of empire are different from the mechanics of war, and Napoleon is about to learn this lesson in blood. By 1812, Napoleon stands at the zenith of his power. He controls France, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain, Germany, and Poland. His brothers sit on thrones across Europe. He has divorced one wife and married another, an Austrian princess, binding himself to the oldest dynasty on the continent. His son, the King of Rome, will inherit an empire that stretches from the Atlantic to the borders of Russia. But Russia will not bend. Tsar Alexander I, still smarting from his defeat at Austerlitz, still resentful of French domination over Europe, refuses to enforce Napoleon's continental system, the economic blockade designed to strangle Britain, and Napoleon, at the height of his power, makes the decision that will destroy him. He will invade Russia. He will march to Moscow. He will force Alexander to submit. The Grande Armée that assembles on the Russian border in June 1812 is the largest army Europe has ever seen. 680,000 men, French, German, Polish, Italian, Spanish, Dutch. They come from every corner of Napoleon's empire. The logistics alone are staggering. Thousands of wagons carry supplies. Hundreds of thousands of horses pull artillery and transport. This is not simply an army, it is a migrating nation. The Russians, commanded by General Mikhail Kutuzov, face an impossible situation. They cannot defeat Napoleon in open battle. Austerlitz proved that. Every engagement they have fought against the French has ended in defeat. But Kutuzov understands something that Napoleon's other enemies did not. You cannot defeat Napoleon by playing his game. You must change the game entirely.
The Russians retreat. They burn their crops, they drive their livestock east, they evacuate their towns. Every mile Napoleon advances, he finds nothing. No supplies, no enemy to fight, just empty land and the vast Russian sky. His soldiers, accustomed to living off the land, find nothing to forage. The supply wagons cannot keep up with the army's advance. Horses die by the thousands. Soldiers begin to starve. Still, Napoleon presses forward. Moscow is ahead. Surely the Russians will defend Moscow. Surely they will offer battle at the ancient capital. Surely they cannot simply let him take it without a fight. At Borodino, 70 miles from Moscow, the Russians finally turn and fight. September 7th, 1812. 130,000 Russian soldiers face 135,000 French. Kutuzov does not attempt the brilliant maneuvers Napoleon expects. He simply digs in. He creates fortifications. He turns the battlefield into a meat grinder, where French elan and genius will count for nothing, where the only question is who can endure more suffering. The Battle of Borodino becomes the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon masses his artillery, 400 guns firing simultaneously, the largest bombardment in military history up to that point. The sound can be heard in Moscow. For 12 hours, the two armies simply slaughter each other. The French take the Russian positions yard by yard, redoubt by redoubt, paying in blood for every foot of ground. There is no brilliance here, no elegant maneuver, just horror. By nightfall, both armies are shattered. 70,000 men lie dead or wounded on a battlefield 7 miles long. The French have technically won, holding the field at day's end, but it is a victory that means nothing. The Russian army, though beaten, withdraws in good order. It is not destroyed. It will fight again. And Napoleon, looking at his casualty lists, understands for the first time that this campaign may be different from all the others. 1 week later, the Grande Armée enters Moscow. The streets are empty. The citizens have evacuated. That night, fires begin. Whether set deliberately by Russians or accidentally by French soldiers, no one knows. But within 2 days, 3/4 of Moscow is burning. Napoleon watches from the Kremlin as the city that was supposed to be his triumph becomes an inferno. The flames light the night sky for miles. The heat is so intense that metal melts. Napoleon waits for Tsar Alexander to negotiate. Days pass. Weeks pass. No envoy arrives. The Tsar will not negotiate. He will not acknowledge defeat. He will simply wait while winter approaches and the French army sits in a burned city 1,000 miles from home with no supplies and no victory. On October 19th, Napoleon gives the order to retreat. It is already too late. The retreat from Moscow is where the Grande Armée dies, not in battle, in snow and ice and starvation. The Russian winter of 1812 arrives early and hits with unprecedented ferocity. Temperatures plunge to 20, 30, 40 degrees below zero. Soldiers wrap themselves in whatever they can find. Many have no proper winter clothing. They had expected to be home by autumn. The Russians do not need to defeat them now. They simply follow, harrying the flanks, cutting off stragglers, waiting for cold and hunger to do their work. Horses die and are immediately butchered for food. Artillery pieces are abandoned when there are no horses to pull them. Soldiers throw away their weapons because frozen fingers cannot hold them anymore. The discipline that made the Grande Armée unstoppable collapses. Units disintegrate. Men wander alone through the snow, lost, dying. At night, those who fall asleep freeze to death. Tens of thousands simply disappear into the white emptiness. At the Berezina River, the French find their path blocked by ice and Russian guns. For 3 days, engineers work waist-deep in freezing water to construct bridges while Russian artillery shells fall among them. Thousands drown. Thousands more are killed by Russian fire. The snow around the river turns red. Of the 680,000 men who invaded Russia, fewer than 100,000 make it back across the border. Most are walking skeletons, frostbitten and broken. The largest army ever assembled has been destroyed, and Napoleon has barely fought a battle. But here is what makes Napoleon dangerous even in defeat. He abandons his army in Poland and races back to Paris, not out of cowardice, but necessity. His enemies, smelling blood, are mobilizing. Prussia has switched sides. Austria wavers. A new coalition is forming. And Napoleon, arriving in Paris while his soldiers still struggle through Russian snow, immediately begins raising a new army. Within months, he has done it. Through conscription, through calling up reserves, through sheer force of will, Napoleon fields another army. Smaller than the one he lost, yes, but still formidable. In the spring of 1813, he defeats the coalition at Lutzen and Bautzen. Against all odds, against all reason, he is winning again. But there is a difference now. His enemies have learned from Russia. They have learned that they cannot beat Napoleon in decisive battles. They must bleed him slowly, avoid his traps, wait for his mistakes. And Napoleon, for the first time in his career, faces an enemy that will not play by his rules.
The war grinds on. 1813 becomes 1814. The coalition masses overwhelming numbers. For every soldier Napoleon conscripts, his enemies field 3. At Leipzig, in October 1813, Napoleon faces 500,000 coalition troops. The Battle of the Nations, they call it, the largest battle in European history before the 20th century. For 3 days, the armies tear each other apart. Napoleon is outnumbered 2-1. His genius cannot overcome such odds. He retreats, leaving 30,000 dead behind him. By 1814, coalition armies are invading France itself. Russian, Prussian, and Austrian soldiers march on Paris. Napoleon fights brilliantly, winning battle after battle against superior numbers. His 6 days campaign becomes a masterpiece of rapid maneuver and aggressive counterattack. But it is not enough. His marshals, exhausted after years of war, pressure him to abdicate. Paris falls. On April 11, 1814, Napoleon signs his abdication. The emperor, who once controlled Europe, is exiled to Elba, a tiny island off the Italian coast. The Bourbon monarchy is restored in France. The old order, it seems, has won. But Napoleon is not finished. For 10 months he sits on Elba, watching, planning. He sees the restored Bourbon king making mistakes, alienating the army, fumbling the peace. He sees his old soldiers restless, talking about glory days, about battles won. He understands that France is not ready to forget him.
On February 26, 1815, Napoleon escapes from Elba with 1,000 loyal soldiers. He lands in southern France. The Bourbon king sends an army to arrest him. When the soldiers see Napoleon walking alone toward them, they break ranks and cheer. Their officers order them to fire. They will not fire on the emperor. Within days, entire regiments are joining him. The king flees to Belgium. Napoleon enters Paris in triumph. He has reconquered France without firing a shot. Europe is stunned. The coalition, meeting at the Congress of Vienna to divide Napoleon's empire, declares him an outlaw. 700,000 coalition troops begin marching toward France. Napoleon has perhaps 200,000 soldiers, many of them hastily recalled veterans and raw conscripts. The mathematics are brutal. He cannot win a long war. He must strike fast, defeat the coalition armies before they unite, force a negotiated peace. In June, he marches into Belgium, where British and Prussian armies are assembling. His plan is classic Napoleon: defeat them separately before they can join forces. On June 16th, he sends Marshal Ney against the British at Quatre Bras, while he engages the Prussians at Ligny. The Prussians are badly beaten and retreat. Everything is proceeding according to plan.
But Marshal Ney, normally aggressive to a fault, hesitates at Quatre Bras. The British commander, the Duke of Wellington, manages to withdraw his army intact. Napoleon pursues, catching Wellington at a small Belgian town called Waterloo. The British take position on a ridge. Napoleon, confident, prepares to attack. If he destroys Wellington's army, the campaign is won. But there is a complication. The Prussians, beaten at Ligny, have not retreated east as Napoleon assumed. They have retreated north, toward Wellington. They are marching to join him. June 18th, 1815. It rained heavily during the night, turning the ground to mud. Napoleon delays his attack, waiting for the ground to dry so his artillery can move effectively. It is a reasonable decision. It may also cost him the battle. Every hour he waits is an hour the Prussians draw closer. The attack begins at 11:30 a.m. French artillery opens fire on Wellington's position. Infantry advances in massive columns. Wellington's troops, sheltered behind the ridge, wait until the French are close before unleashing devastating volleys. The French reach the ridgeline and are thrown back. They attack again. Again they are repulsed. Marshal Ney, desperate to break Wellington's line, orders cavalry charges. Thousands of French horsemen gallop toward British squares, infantry formations designed specifically to defeat cavalry. The squares hold. The cavalry circles them uselessly, taking fire from all sides. Ney sends more cavalry. The British hold. French horsemen lie dead in piles around the British squares. And then, in the afternoon, Prussian troops begin appearing on Napoleon's right flank. Not the entire Prussian army yet, just advance units, but more are coming. Napoleon now fights on two fronts. He sends his young guard, elite troops held in reserve, to hold off the Prussians. The battle becomes desperate. Wellington's line is wavering but has not broken. The Prussians are pressing harder. Time is running out. Napoleon makes his final throw of the dice. The Imperial Guard, the most elite troops in the French army, men who have never been defeated, have been held in reserve all day. Now, at 7 in the evening, Napoleon sends them forward. If they break Wellington's center, the battle is won. If they fail, there is nothing left.
The Imperial Guard marches forward in perfect formation, through artillery fire, through musket volleys, toward the ridge where Wellington's most experienced troops wait. They climb the slope, drums beating, colors flying. They reach the crest. And then Wellington's troops, who had been lying down to shelter from artillery, stand up and unleash a volley at point-blank range. The Imperial Guard staggers. They return fire. For long minutes, the two forces simply stand and shoot at each other, reloading and firing as fast as they can. Men drop on both sides. Smoke obscures everything. And then someone in the French ranks shouts the words that have never been spoken before. La garde recule. The guard retreats. The psychological impact is immediate and catastrophic. If the Guard can be beaten, Napoleon can be beaten. French units all across the battlefield begin to break. Wellington orders a general advance. The Prussians attack in force. The French army, undefeated for 20 years, disintegrates. Soldiers throw away weapons and run. Napoleon himself barely escapes capture. The Battle of Waterloo lasts 9 hours. 50,000 men lie dead or wounded. Napoleon's last army is destroyed. His last gamble has failed.
4 days later, Napoleon abdicates again. This time there will be no comfortable exile to Elba. The British transport him to St. Helena, a barren island in the South Atlantic, as far from Europe as they can send him. He will spend the last 6 years of his life there, dictating his memoirs, arguing with his jailers, slowly dying. When he dies in 1821, probably from stomach cancer, Europe breathes a collective sigh of relief. The Napoleonic Wars are over. 12 years of near-constant warfare have left 3 to 6 million dead, depending on how you count. The map of Europe has been redrawn multiple times. The Holy Roman Empire is gone. Dozens of small German states have been consolidated. Poland has been partitioned again. The Bourbon dynasty is restored in France, but everything has changed. The old certainties of the 18th century, the divine right of kings, the rigid social hierarchies have been shaken to their foundations. But Napoleon's legacy is not simply measured in battles won and lost, in empires gained and forfeited. He transformed warfare itself. The core system, mass conscription, living off the land, concentrating artillery, seeking decisive battle, these became the standard practices of every European army. The Prussians, the Russians, the British all studied his campaigns and adopted his methods. Every military academy in the world, even today, teaches Napoleon's battles as examples of operational art. His Code Napoleon, the legal reforms he instituted, spread across Europe and influenced legal systems worldwide. His emphasis on merit over birth, though honored more in the breach than the observance during his own reign, planted ideas that could not be uprooted. The nationalism his conquests inadvertently sparked would reshape Europe throughout the 19th century. And there is something else. Napoleon proved that one individual, through genius and ruthlessness, could reshape the world. For better or worse, he demonstrated that history is not simply the product of vast impersonal forces, but can be bent by human will. He showed what was possible when brilliance and ambition combined with historical circumstances. He also showed the limits of that power, demonstrated that genius alone cannot overcome basic mathematics, that even the greatest mind cannot sustain an empire on will alone. The mechanics of Napoleon's wars reveal a fundamental truth about warfare and human endeavor. Brilliance can achieve the impossible,
but only temporarily. Innovation can defeat larger forces, but only until those forces learn and adapt. One man can conquer a continent, but he cannot hold it forever, because conquest is not governance, and victory in battle is not victory in peace.
Napoleon understood the mechanics of war better than anyone before him, and perhaps anyone since. He did not understand the mechanics of peace, the complex balance of interests and compromises that sustain international order. He believed that if he could just win one more battle, achieve one more victory, finally and completely defeat his enemies, then peace would follow. He never learned that peace must be built, not won. At Waterloo, facing defeat, Napoleon supposedly remarked, "What a beautiful death." He was speaking of dying in battle, going down fighting rather than surrendering. He survived Waterloo, only to die slowly on St. Helena, dictating self-serving memoirs, arguing about his food, growing fat and bitter. It was not a beautiful death. Perhaps that is fitting. The man who lived by the sword, who reshaped warfare for a new century, who conquered and destroyed and built and burned across a continent, deserved neither a hero's death on the battlefield nor a peaceful passing in old age. He deserved exactly what he got: time to contemplate everything he achieved and everything he threw away. Time to understand that all his genius had brought him only to a barren rock in the middle of the ocean, forgotten by the world he once dominated. The drums of war fell silent in 1815. The cannons ceased their thunder. The soldiers went home, or died, or became veterans who told stories no one quite believed. Europe entered a period of relative peace that would last until 1914, when everything Napoleon had unleashed would return in even more terrible form, when the mechanics of industrial warfare would make his campaigns look almost quaint. But for 12 years, one man and the armies he led had proven what was possible. They had shown that the old ways could be swept aside, that hierarchy and tradition meant nothing against innovation and will. They had demonstrated that a world could be unmade and remade by one person's vision. And when that vision failed, when the armies were defeated and the emperor was exiled and the old order was restored, Europe remembered. The world remembered. We remember still, studying those battles, analyzing those campaigns, arguing about whether he was a genius or a tyrant or both. Perhaps that is Napoleon's truest legacy, not the battles won or the empires lost, but the simple proof that one individual can matter, that history can be changed, that nothing is inevitable until it is over. The Napoleonic Wars ended at Waterloo. But the ideas they unleashed, the changes they wrought, the questions they raised about power and ambition and the limits of human achievement, those never ended at all. They echo still in every conflict, in every revolution, in every moment when someone looks at the world as it is and imagines what it could be and decides that they will be the one to make it so, regardless of the cost. That is the mechanics of war. That is Napoleon's legacy. That is what those 12 years meant and what they mean still. The drums fall silent. The story ends, but the questions remain.